Good morning. Excited to share more about designing for adoption in Web3 today. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Curious, who here is working on a Web3 product? Oh, interesting. Most people are not. Okay, I'm surprised. What are you guys working on? Or like, why are you here if you're not working on a Web3 project? Who didn't raise their hand?
Support the police, you know?
Okay, cool. Okay, so quick intro about myself. I'm Sin, or Cynthia. I'm the co-founder and CEO of DTravel, which is a Web3 travel ecosystem, and I'll talk about that next. I also co-founded the largest short-term rental host forum that I've been running for the past 10 years, and then also have been in Web3 since 2017. I co-founded Altcoin Fantasy, which is a crypto gaming startup that we built to over 350,000 users from 2017 to 2020, all organic. And I've been a nomad and living in an RV since 2017, but I moved to Lisbon this year, so unfortunately no longer live in an RV. And I also love to play Magic and go to music festivals, so if anybody here plays Magic or goes to music festivals, definitely hit me up. Either someone likes Magic or someone likes music festivals, hopefully both. We are in Web3, I guess everybody is a nerd here. So DTravel is a Web3 travel ecosystem, and vacation rentals or short-term rentals is my background. I've been a host for the last 10 years. And so DTravel is really solving a lot of the problems that I've experienced personally as a host. And having worked in Web3, I came to see that a lot of the problems that exist in this industry could actually be solved with Web3. So our vision really is about empowering direct connections between hosts and guests and cutting out intermediaries, because it ends up costing a lot of money for both parties and it leads to a worse experience. And so our first product, DTravel Direct, is, you can think of it like a Shopify for short-term rental operators to create a beautiful branded premium website that they can then share with guests and book peer-to-peer, cutting out intermediaries. And that saves anywhere from 20 to 35% in fees, which is pretty significant, obviously. And we have some distribution products that are coming out soon. So in Q1 of next year, we're going to have a AI search tool that you can basically input anything that you're looking for, and it'll bring back search results specifically for direct booking websites, meaning you're always going to book peer-to-peer and again save that money. We also are building out our DTravel protocol long-term, and so this is essentially a problem that exists in the short-term rental industry, where if you're trying to build and you want to connect to another software provider, you have to build all of these individual API integrations. And every API integration is custom, meaning that there's no consistency and it takes a lot of time and effort to both build and maintain. And so the DTravel protocol will essentially be like a single source of truth. You can think of it like a master API that every company in the industry, if they just want to connect to another company, they just build to this one API or the protocol, and they'll be able to get listing data and booking data. So it's going to add a lot of efficiency and reduce a lot of costs for the industry. So I'm really, really excited about that. Today, we're obviously talking about designing for adoption in Web3. So what does that actually mean? How do you define adoption? What does that actually look like? What are the things that you need to think about when you're designing for adoption? And we're going to do something a little bit different today. So at the end, there's going to be a fun exercise where you guys get to apply all the things that I talked about today to designing for adoption, and actually share some suggestions on how you think you can redesign a product that I'm going to show. So when we think about designing for adoption, we often think about these buzzwords, these terms that relate to design and user experience. But it's very difficult to actually translate these words into an actual product, right? Like when you say, what is something that is a great user experience, what does that actually look like? And I think when we actually get to Web3 adoption, it's when somebody uses an app and not only do they not know that it's a Web3 dApp, it's not even relevant. It should be seamless, super easy to use, very familiar, and most importantly, I think it should feel like a Web2 experience, but with all the benefits of Web3, because that's what Web3 does best, right? It should feel seamless and provide the benefits, and it doesn't even matter that it's Web3. And this app I included because I thought it was really interesting. So it's the #1 app on dApp Radar, which tracks dApp ratings. And they have, in the last 30 days, had over 2 million unique wallets connect and do some sort of transaction. So the app is called Kai, I think, is how you pronounce it. It's built on Near, and it's basically a rewards app. So you can either shop at their partners, or you can create a food order and get rewards. So it's a pretty simple use case of Web3. But I think it does it really, really well, obviously evidenced by how many people are using them. And I think that in Web3, we as an industry love complex, challenging things. We like technical challenges. We like to overcomplicate things. And we don't think simple problems are sexy, which I get, right? But this is such a good example of the kind of apps that we need to build for consumers, because our industry is so subject to boom and bust cycles. Every time there's a bull market, you get a rush of people coming in, and then there's a bear market and everybody leaves. And the only way for us to get to adoption is when we build stuff that people want to use regardless of what the market cycle is, because it's so ubiquitous in their life that they're using it day to day. And I think this is such a good example of that. So what are the things that we have to think about when we're designing for adoption? And I've included 5 that I think are important. Visual design, design patterns, designing for trust, thinking about your user evolution, and then reducing complexity. So the first is visual design. When we think about visual design, there's this concept called the usability aesthetic effect. And it basically says, if you have a beautiful product, people are going to be a lot more forgiving, even if it's a shitty experience, just because the product itself looks beautiful. And so they're a lot more forgiving about it. If any of you guys are familiar with cognitive biases, it's very similar to this concept of the halo effect, where people who are attractive get ascribed positive qualities, and people who are not attractive get ascribed negative qualities, even though there's clearly no evidence to back it up. But this is the same thing in design, where if you have a product that's really beautiful, people are going to be a lot more forgiving if the experience is a little bit janky. And I think in Web3, obviously, because it's so new, technology and tooling is still fairly nascent, but a lot better than it used to be. The more pleasing your app is, the more that user will probably continue along that journey and be forgiving about the bugs and janky UX. And we talk about design as this sort of like monolithic concept. But design is very, very, very personal. I'm sure anybody who's worked with a designer has probably come across this, where they do something and you're like, I hate this. Because design is very subjective. And so how do you take something that is a very subjective concept and have it meet a very specific business use case? And I put these examples here. I don't know if anyone's used Curve, and then there's Boys Club, which is a really awesome female community. And if you look at these two, they're definitely like vibes, right? And there's a saying that your vibe attracts your tribe. And I think these two companies or projects have been very deliberate about building a specific vibe, because they want to attract a specific type of user to their community. And it's very, very clear, like they've been very deliberate about that. So I think that when you are designing your product, it's good to be deliberate about who your ideal user is, because now you can design that experience, not only to kind of weed out the people that are probably not going to be ideal users, but also attract the type of people who are going to be ideal users. And so it becomes kind of like a self-selecting process. Design patterns. So if anybody isn't familiar with this concept of design patterns, is essentially a design component that's reused over and over. So if you think about buttons, buttons tend to be the same across every app. Hamburger menu tends to be the same, so once you go to one app, you kind of know what it does. And when we have new design patterns, people perceive that as strange or dangerous because they've never seen it before. And so there's a high drop-off when you introduce a new design pattern. And there's a difference between Web 2 and Web 3 design patterns, right? Somebody who uses a Web 2 app, they're very familiar with the app, they know what it does, the functionality, etc. But when they come to a Web 3 app and they have to interact with a wallet, that's a very new design pattern. Web 3 natives are very familiar, so they're totally comfortable with it. But for a Web 2 person, especially if you're talking about C phrases, signing transactions, looking at amounts, etc., they're like, what the hell is this? And they're out. And so it's very important to think about who your user is, because in a Web3 dApp, if your target user is a DeFi degen, you actually almost want to make sure that you include that complexity, because that's what they've come to recognize and that's what they trust. And so if you take that away, if you take away, let's say, signing a transaction or authorizing or something, we might actually think, oh, this app is a scam. And so design patterns are not the same that you should use, depending on who your ideal user is or your end user is. I talked about this a little bit, but Web3 apps and that interaction is so new and unfamiliar that we want to use design patterns that are familiar as much as possible because we're reducing cognitive load. So they already have to learn interacting with a wallet. So you don't want to have to teach them a new design pattern like where they have to press a button and it's actually like sliding or something. So we want to reduce that cognitive load as much as possible. Don't reinvent the wheel here. Trust. So trust means different things to different people. Again, if you're designing for somebody who's a DeFi degen, I'm actually convinced that degens love complexity. They feel like an insider when something is complex and when other people can't use it or is like, oh my god, what is this? This is so confusing. Whereas somebody who's in Web 2, if they ever had to interact with a DeFi protocol, like, yeah, DeFi is probably not going to go mainstream for that reason. But again, it's very important to understand who your user is because how you build trust with them is going to depend on what they perceive as being trustworthy. And I think the product I'm going to show you at the end will kind of evidence this, so I'll get back to this concept. And trust signals. Again, you want to, every step along the way, find a way to introduce to your user why they should trust you and your app and continue along that path. So if, for example, you have a wallet or an app that is meant to be a consumer app, maybe initially you don't introduce the concept of wallets until they absolutely need to for some reason. Like maybe they need to get a reward, and that's when you introduce it because they already feel bought into it and it feels relevant at that point. You don't want to introduce too much initially. And I think that with apps, there's probably a couple of things that every app should do to build that trust. And I'll give you an example. With Airbnb, when they first started in 2007, the concept of somebody staying in your house, some stranger, was very weird. Now we're super used to getting into a car with strangers, having people stay at our house, etc. But at the time, it was very bizarre. And they identified two things that would make a big, big change to whether or not somebody booked. The first was if a host had a host profile where they talked about their interests, what they liked, where they came from, etc., a potential guest reading that would then feel like, oh, I know this person. They're normal and like they're probably not going to kill me. The second thing was listing photos. So if a host had good listing photos, that guest felt a lot more comfortable staying there. And so they basically initially actually went to everybody's house to take listing photos, which is pretty interesting. But just these two things that they did made such a big difference to their conversion rate. And so I think within every app, you have to identify what those small things are that really, they're 20% of the things that you do that cause 80% of the benefits and the increase in trust. This is something I'm really, really, really passionate about. So in Web3, I think because the industry is still pretty new and things change so quickly from month to month, we don't think long-term in terms of the products that we're designing for. And in product management, there's this concept of the adjacent user theory. And what's important is that you need to know who you're starting with in terms of what your ideal persona looks like, but then also where you want to end up. And that's really important because the delta between those two is what you need to build towards and have a roadmap for. So let's say that your first user, they've onboarded successfully, you've built for them, and they've all converted. How you move to the next adjacent user is that user has 70 to 80% in common with that first user. But there's probably like 20 to 30% of difference. So what you want to do is build those features, onboard those users successfully, and then they become a successful user, and now you move to the next adjacent user. And so you go outward on and on and on until you end up at that sort of end user that you want to build towards. What is good to keep in mind is that as you're building this out, the users that you're going to attract as your product matures is actually going to change. And so you might always have to constantly be thinking about who your end user is and whether they're going to continue to be that ideal user that you're building for. So there's an evolution in that. And we have a saying at DTravel, which is design holistically and build incrementally. So always take small steps instead of trying to wait to build this massive thing and not get feedback, because you don't want to over-engineer, which is definitely a big problem. It's a waste of resources, but also you don't know what is truly a driver for your users. So it's good to be iterative in terms of how you actually build. And then finally, complexity. So I think this is a big, big challenge that we have in Web3. We love complexity, we love insider language, we love acronyms, and that's great if you're building for a Web3 audience, and I think that's definitely something that you want to lean into. But if you're building for a Web2 audience, obviously that's something that is going to be problematic, because instantly it alienates the user. And so my challenge to you is, if you're building something that is really meant for a Web2 audience, doesn't even matter that you're using Web3 or crypto. Like, maybe if you're giving out rewards, or if you have an NFT for access, you don't even use those terms. You just say, here's a reward that you can get in your account. Here's something that will give you access in terms of the access membership. I think we are so conditioned to always use terminology because we're comfortable with it. But we should not pass on our laziness to the end user, because it's not their job to decipher, right? It's our job as builders, as designers, as engineers, to make sure that we build good user experiences, not based on what we want, but what our users want. And then this, I think, is probably one of the most important points I'll make, which is we need to design for normal people. Because normal people is the way to commercial success and mainstream adoption in Web3. We cannot grow our industry if we're always designing DeFi apps. I love DeFi apps, but I don't think my mom is going to use a DeFi app. And so we have to design for normal people. And there's a resistance, I think, because we as Web3 natives, we want to feel special in that complexity and that experience. So I think that there's a path where you can both design for normal people, but also give Web3 natives a way to configure it for them. So I'll give a concrete example. Right now we're building out wallets, so every customer on DTravel will be able to create a non-custodial wallet using social login. We are also going to be deploying to other chains, so our booking contracts will be available on different chains, and there will be tokens that they'll be able to configure on those chains. However, we obviously don't want to introduce that kind of complexity for a new user. So how we're diverging the two paths is, for anybody who's creating a wallet using social login, they just get a default configuration, meaning that they're going to have one chain that they deploy on and only a small selection of tokens, which are going to be stable coins, that they can choose from. But if you're somebody who logs in with a Web3 wallet, like Trust Wallet, MetaMask, etc., you can configure both the chain as well as the tokens on each chain that you want to accept. And so thinking about how you can build for two people or two different personas, if that is what you want to do, is important, because you don't want to alienate your power users, but you also don't want to alienate the people who don't have any experience. So always thinking about how you can build the experience for those two people. So quick recap, visual design, basically anything that looks good, people will be more forgiving of. Design patterns, people are lazy, so don't make them do any work in thinking about how to use your app. Know how to provide trust signals so that people want to continue. Think about where you want to start and where you want to end up in terms of your user evolution. And then always, always, always keep it simple. Does anybody know what this is?
A scanner machine?
Yeah. Anyone not used Etherscan before? Okay.
Everyone uses a scanner.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, perfect, exactly. So if you had to design this for people who are not Web3 natives, so imagine your mom who's like, honey, I sent you $5 of Bitcoin. Can you please tell me how to check? How would you design this so it feels familiar and welcoming and not so scary?
I wouldn't design it. I think the point of Etherscan is to get details of transactions, and if you just want to know if you got the money, that's something that should be done at the wallet level.
At the app level?
At the wallet level. You should have in your wallet, you can see all incoming transaction, outgoing transaction, but even asking people to go on an external website to see if they've been paid not something, it's not a good design for non-technical people.
Yeah, that
So
makes
I wouldn't
sense.
make a paper scan for normies.
Yeah. Well, if you had to, though, what would you do differently? Is there a path, or are you saying, like, you cannot change this into...
We can improve that, I think. So, yeah, I guess we can improve that. We are a bit far away, so first it looks like very difficult. There is this advertising as well, so I'm not just... I don't know if it's usually there, but I think that's a bad thing. So first thing, removing that.
And you remove your revenue also.
Find another way, try to find another way to monetize. And then definitely less stuff in the web page. I think something like Uniswap was maybe a killer app because there was like, it was so easy, you know, you just see one thing, you need another one, you click, and that's it. So very minimalistic web page.
Yeah. So maybe already from the beginning, did it go through or not? Success
Yes.
or fail?
Yes, exactly.
And then a picture and symbols, because I recognized the Bitcoin logo. Okay, so from this to this, because here, what the fuck happened? Did I transfer to a drug addict, or what the fuck happened?
Yeah.
You know? It's in Zimbabwe now, I don't know what happened. And then maybe drop down, where you actually can see all the technical stuff that happened. If you're a pro user, you find it interesting, you want to see what actually happened, if it failed, for example. But if you just your mom, you don't care, it just failed, okay, I need to try again. You don't need to, what was the specific,
Yeah. No, I think what it raises is a very important point, which is when you're designing something, what is the most important information that needs to be there? What is the goal that the user is trying to get to? And is what you're designing going to meet that goal? So yeah, when I think about designing this, I think about maybe like tabs or like another section where at the top, very simple, like, was it successful? Who did you send it to? Ideally not like 0x, whatever. Not even showing like the contract address, like all of these things. I think there's a good way to simplify this, and my concern in people saying that we shouldn't have this for new people is that this is unfortunately where a lot of people go when they're getting into Web3 to check different things that they're doing. And I think wallets have gotten a lot better, but people are still going here. And so if we can make this interaction a lot better, I think we'll get a lot more people coming into the space, because unfortunately this is still part of the user experience for people in Web3, even new people. So I think there's a lot that we can do to change this. Second question is, what are familiar design patterns that you might use for normal people based on similar interactions or apps that they use to fulfill a similar purpose? So think about banking, PayPal, anything like that. Is there anything we can take away from those design patterns that could be applied here?
If it's for transactions like nobody's just sending money between each other, we need more of a most design on transaction explorer. So that focuses more on emphasizing the amount sent, what the purpose was, or if there was any transaction memo, as well as it does give an identifier, but it puts it in a very non-intrusive place so that a user that is trying to locate a specific transaction is able to locate it, but at the same time, it's not very like private. Braintree, the company that owns Venmo and Cash, I think just Venmo, has a UI kit for specifically designing payment applications that might be useful for people in crypto for doing that.
There you go. That's very helpful to know. Thank you. Okay, awesome. So thank you for humoring me with that exercise. I always think it's fun to try and apply things that you learn in talks. So here's my contact information. If you want to say hi or hang out, I live in Lisbon and I organize events all the time. So yeah, definitely hope to meet some of you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.